First, introduction, when cold became a weapon of silence. The winter of 1944 did not arrive like a season, it arrived like an ambush. No warnings, no forecasts, no safety nets. Just a sudden, merciless wall of cold descending on a continent already torn open by war. And in those first 15 seconds of freezing breath, one truth became undeniable. In total war, the most dangerous enemy is often the one you cannot hear. Bombs had not only shattered homes and streets, they had shattered the very lifelines that kept people warm. Electrical grids lay in ruins. Gas lines were twisted metal. Coal depots smoldered in smoking craters. Every source of heat, every ember of comfort was either destroyed or seized for military needs. Across Europe, cities lay in darkness. Families pressed together in roofless rooms where winter wind sliced through broken walls like a blade. Soldiers crouched in frozen trenches where damp uniforms clung to their skin, turning their bodies into slow-moving ice. And as temperatures fell, the truth became brutally clear. Cold was not weather. Cold was a weapon. Yet this story is not only about suffering, it is about the mindset that kept thousands alive. A mindset built not on comfort, but on understanding how heat behaves, how it escapes, and how a tiny, almost insignificant invention would decide who lived through the winter and who didn't. Stay with us, because what saved lives in 1944 still matters today, and it begins with the simple act of learning how to hold on to warmth when the world offers none. Second, when heating systems collapsed, warmth became a rare resource. As the war reached its bitter peak, Europeans found themselves trapped inside structures that no longer protected them. Civilians slept in rooms where entire walls had been blasted away, leaving nothing between them and the winter air. Glass windows had vanished, replaced by scraps of cloth that barely slowed the wind. Basements, once safe havens, became damp, freezing chambers where frost grew along the floor in the shape of the night's breath. On the front lines, soldiers fought a second war against a relentless enemy, the cold itself. Trenches filled with frozen mud, foxholes became shallow bowls of ice, uniforms soaked during marches hardened overnight, and boots froze around feet until movement became agony. Every gust of wind felt like a warning that warmth was slipping out of the world. Hypothermia did not announce itself with drama. It crept in quietly, fingers turned numb, reflexes slowed, thought became fog. Then came the irresistible pull to sleep, a sleep many never woke from. Men who had survived artillery fire, sniper rounds, and starvation were undone by the simple loss of heat. This is the harsh lesson World War II carved into human memory. The human body does not negotiate with cold. Warmth is not luxury. Warmth is biology. And once the systems that produced it collapsed, people had to reinvent warmth using whatever fragments of knowledge and material they still possessed. What they built next was neither powerful nor elegant, but it was enough. And enough is sometimes the most important word in survival. Third, the deadly misconception. Why ordinary candles couldn't save anyone. In desperation, many turned to the closest thing they had, a simple wax candle. It had a flame. It had light. It looked like hope in a dark room. Yet this hope was built on a fatal misunderstanding. A candle can illuminate a room, but it cannot warm it. The physics is unforgiving. The heat from an open flame rises straight upward, disappearing into the rafters or leaking through shattered roofs. It does not radiate outward. It does not stay near the body. A candle burns, but the warmth it produces escapes faster than it can help the living beings gathered around it. Thousands discovered this painful truth when it was already too late. They lit candles believing they had created a pocket of safety, only to find the air around them barely changed. The flame survived, but they did not. This contradiction, this betrayal of expectation, is where our story truly begins. Because when people realized that fire and warmth were not the same thing, they were forced to rethink everything they knew about heat. And that realization, born of fear and necessity, led to the creation of one of the simplest yet most ingenious survival tools of the war. A tiny heat candle designed not to waste its warmth, but to deliver it exactly where a human body needed it most. A flame alone is not enough. Understanding the flame is what saves you, and that is the lesson written in both ingenuity and tragedy during the coldest winters of World War II. Fourth, historical evidence. who used the heat candle where it appeared, and why it saved lives. To understand how a tiny improvised heater saved thousands, we have to look at where it appeared and who depended on it. This was not a marginal tool used by a handful of survivors. It emerged everywhere the cold pressed hardest. In the final winter of the war, Germany's civilian population was hit with a catastrophic collapse of fuel supply. Coal trains no longer ran. City depots stood empty. Entire regions had no access to heating for weeks. Families in Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, and dozens of smaller towns slept in half-destroyed apartments where temperatures often dropped well below freezing. People scavenged old candle stubs, cooking fat, and bits of cardboard from ruins to assemble something, anything, that produced more than a fragile flame. In occupied Poland and France, the situation was even tighter. Heating was rationed, monitored, and restricted. Stoves could not run long. Wood gathering was sometimes forbidden. Civilians learned quickly that a heat candle, built from scraps, was one of the few tools the occupying powers could not take away. On the front lines, soldiers discovered the same truth in foxholes and makeshift field shelters. Standard-issue gear could block the wind, but it could not generate warmth. When temperatures plunged and gloves stiffened into useless shapes, men lit heat candles to keep their hands flexible enough to operate weapons. They used them to keep water from freezing into solid blocks overnight. They placed socks and rags near the slow-burning flame so they would be dry enough to wear the next morning. Civil defense manuals from Britain, Germany, and even the Soviet Union show diagrams nearly identical in structure: a tin can, rolled cardboard or cloth forming a wick matrix, and wax poured over the top. These documents emphasized ventilation, carefully noting that the device was safe only when oxygen could circulate. Across battlefields, basements, and refugee shelters, the pattern repeats. Heat candles did not warm entire rooms, and they were never meant to. They preserved circulation, they protected motor function, they maintained the biological threshold between life and death. And that is the point every survivor account makes clear: a heat candle did not save spaces, it saved bodies. Because survival in the winter of 1944 did not depend on comfort. It depended on keeping the human machine functioning just long enough to see another sunrise. 5. A spontaneous invention, when desperation turned people into engineers. One of the most extraordinary truths about the survival heat candle is that it had no inventor. No patent, no military designation, no factory ever produced it. It emerged organically, almost simultaneously, across different nations. An invention born not from brilliance, but from sheer necessity. There was no blueprint, no central authority teaching civilians how to build one. It was improvisation at scale, driven by the same desperate logic. If a candle wastes heat upward, then maybe a container can hold that heat, direct it, slow it down, stretch it. In Warsaw, families experimented with rolled newspapers soaked in leftover paraffin. In France, resistance fighters used paint cans filled with scraps of cloth dipped in animal fat. In Germany, children learned from neighbors how to melt wax from broken church candles and pour it over corrugated cardboard stuffed into soup tins. And along the Eastern Front, soldiers discovered that even grease saved from cooking could fuel a makeshift heater that burned long into the night. These designs were not identical, yet they converged on the same principle through trial and error. People noticed which arrangements burned too fast, which ones smoked too heavily, which ones overheated the can. They shared what worked with neighbors, whispered instructions in shelters, passed ideas through letters and diaries. Innovation spread not through textbooks, but through survival instinct. This is why the heat candle stands apart from other wartime inventions. It wasn't engineered from above, it was discovered from below. It was a rare moment in history when millions of individuals, scattered across borders and divided by conflict, all solved the same problem in nearly the same way. And that is the deeper lesson. The most effective survival tools in human history were not designed, they were recognized. They were the result of observing nature, respecting physical laws, and shaping whatever scraps were available into something that worked. The heat candle is a reminder that innovation begins the moment we stop asking, "What do we lack?" and start asking, "What can we build from what remains?" 6th, inside a survival heat candle, the design that saved lives. At first glance, a heat candle looks unimpressive. A tin can, some cardboard, a bit of wax. Yet inside that crude shell lies a structure far more sophisticated than it appears, because every component performs a critical function. The metal container is not just a holder, it is a radiator. Tin or steel absorbs the flame's energy and spreads it sideways, releasing warmth at the height where cold hands and faces need it most. Instead of letting heat escape upward, the can converts the flame into a small but efficient source of radiant warmth. Inside the can, rolled cardboard or tightly bundled cloth forms a dense wick matrix. This dramatically increases surface area, allowing fuel to burn slowly and steadily rather than in a quick, wasteful flare. The material acts like the capillaries of a living organism, drawing melted wax upward and feeding the flame at a controlled pace. Then comes the fuel itself. Wax was the ideal resource often scavenged from broken candles or melted from leftover stubs. But when wax ran out, people used tallow, grease, or even the oily remnants of cooking fires. The most effective ratio discovered across Europe was roughly 3 parts wax to 1 part cardboard or cloth. This blend created a long, stable burn curve, hot enough to matter, but slow enough to last through the night. When combined, these elements produced a tiny device capable of generating usable warmth for hours, using almost nothing. It wasn't powerful, it wasn't beautiful, but it worked. And in the physics of survival, function always outweighs form. What made the heat candle remarkable was not its flame, but its efficiency. It turned scraps into energy, it turned ruins into resources, and above all, it turned knowledge into survival. This was not a trick. It was energy management understanding how heat behaves and mastering it in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. 7. The crucial shift. From open flame to radiant heat. What made the survival heat candle truly remarkable was not its flame, but what it transformed that flame into. Most people assume that fire equals warmth, but in the physics of survival, that assumption can be fatal. The heat from an open flame rises instantly, shooting upward like a thermal spear. It creates a pocket of hot air far above the body, while the person huddled near the candle remains dangerously cold. Flame heat is local, unstable, and worst of all, it fails to support the body's core temperature. Radiant heat behaves differently. It does not drift away. It reaches outward. It touches the skin. It warms the blood flowing beneath the surface. Radiant warmth is biological warmth, the kind that keeps hands functional, muscles responsive, and the heart pumping at a safe rhythm. When radiant heat hits the skin, it prevents the deadly spiral of hypothermia, the slow decline where numbness becomes confusion, confusion becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion becomes silence. And this principle holding heat where humans actually need it is one of the oldest survival lessons in history. The Romans used it in their hypercausts, channeling heat beneath floors to radiate upward through stone. Northern Europeans built masonry stoves that stored fire inside heavy brick walls, releasing warmth long after the flames had died. Even the humble clay pot heater used in medieval homes relied on the exact same physics: trap heat, then radiate it slowly. The survival heat candle was the wartime descendant of these ancient systems. It took the messy, fleeting energy of an open flame and converted it into steady, skin-level warmth. This wasn't just clever, it was the difference between a flame that flickers beautifully and a source of heat that keeps a living body alive through the longest night of the war. 8. The biological threshold. Why a few degrees can save a life. The genius of the heat candle becomes undeniable when you understand what cold truly does to the human body. Hypothermia doesn't begin when a room feels chilly. It begins the moment the body's core temperature drops below roughly 35 degrees Celsius. From that point forward, the body starts losing functions one by one. Fingers stiffen, dexterity fades, judgment blurs, and the heart begins to strain. But here is the part that surprises most people. You don't need to raise the air temperature dramatically to interrupt this decline. You only need to stop the body from crossing its biological breaking point. If the hands stay above about 10 degrees Celsius, blood continues to flow. Muscles remain usable. If the core temperature can be kept stable, even by the smallest margin, the cascade of hypothermia never takes hold. Survival is not about feeling warm. It is about not falling below the threshold where the body loses control. This is why radiant heat is vastly superior to warming the air. Air absorbs energy slowly and loses it quickly. But radiant heat, delivered directly to the skin, strengthens the body's defenses immediately. A person thawed by radiant heat regains dexterity, awareness, and mobility long before the surrounding air begins to rise. And that leads to the scientific truth behind every wartime survivor's testimony. A heat candle didn't make anyone comfortable. It didn't melt the frost on the walls. But it held the human body just above the point of collapse. It bought time. It kept circulation moving. It kept life within reach. Because in the coldest battles of WWII, survival didn't require warmth, only that the body never slipped below the line where cold becomes lethal. 9. Multiplying heat. When civilians accidentally invented a heat exchanger, as remarkable as a single heat candle was, what came next was even more ingenious. Across Europe, civilians discovered, without coordination, without manuals, that several heat candles placed close together could create something far more powerful than the sum of their flames. And they found that covering those candles with a clay pot, a metal bucket, or even a battered cooking pot fundamentally changed the way heat behaved. Instead of flames shooting upwards and disappearing, the cover absorbed the rising energy, storing it inside its thick walls. Once heated, the pot radiated warmth sideways in every direction, creating a slow, even pulse of heat that lasted long after the flames had burned down. This turned a handful of makeshift heaters into a crude but effective heat exchanger, an unintentional copy of the very systems ancient civilizations had built from stone and clay. The physics behind it is simple but profound. Thermal mass holds heat. Delayed radiation releases it gently. Together, they transform short-lived flame heat into long-lived usable warmth. A family gathered around such a setup could keep their hands flexible, their breath unfrozen, and their bodies above the collapse point for hours on end. Soldiers used this same trick in field shelters, placing pots or metal helmets over clustered candles to create a warm zone where gear could dry overnight. What makes this moment in history so extraordinary is that thousands of people, separated by language, distance, and war, arrived at the same solution almost simultaneously. It wasn't engineering. It was instinct sharpened by desperation, and through that instinct, they uncovered a truth far more powerful than fire itself. They didn't need more heat. They just needed to stop losing the heat they already had. That was the essence of winter survival during World War II. They weren't fighting to create warmth. They were fighting to keep warmth from escaping. 10. Safety, the narrow line between life and death. For all its brilliance, the survival heat candle carried a danger as silent as the winter itself. Carbon monoxide and oxygen depletion, the invisible killers of enclosed spaces. They had no smell, no sting, no warning. People who trusted the flame blindly often never realized what was happening until it was too late. Those who lived understood one rule above all others: always ventilate. Even in the coldest rooms, even in bombed-out basements where every breath turned to crystals, survivors kept a crack in the window, a broken brick removed from the wall, or a chimney open just enough to let air circulate. They knew that a small loss of heat was a small price to pay for the oxygen that kept them alive. Those who died made the opposite mistake. They believed sealing every gap would trap warmth. Instead, it trapped poison. Many victims were found with candles still burning beside them, flames glowing peacefully while their bodies succumbed not to the cold, but to the air they could no longer breathe. It was a cruel irony. The tool meant to preserve life could take it away when used without respect. And that is the stark lesson winter teaches more ruthlessly than war itself. In extreme conditions, ignorance kills faster than cold. Fire, heat, and shelter mean nothing if the air turns against you. The survivors of 1944 did not merely outlast the cold. They learned to negotiate with it, understanding that survival is never just about adding warmth. It is about managing every force that interacts with it, both visible and unseen. 11. The forgotten variants, innovations born from necessity. While the classic heat candle design became widespread, countless variations bloomed across Europe, each adapted to whatever scraps people could find. These forgotten versions reflect a truth about human ingenuity. Survival is rarely about following one perfect design. It's about adapting constantly. Some families mixed salt into the wax to reduce smoke, making their heaters safer inside cramped shelters. Others discovered that adding pine pitch extended burn time, allowing a single candle to last through the longest night. When wax disappeared completely, people turned to animal fat, cooking grease, or hardened drippings scraped from abandoned kitchens. Anything that could melt and burn became fuel. But the ingenuity didn't stop there. A heat candle was more than a heater. It became a miniature survival station. Soldiers dried socks and gloves over it so they wouldn't freeze to their skin the next morning. Civilians placed cups of water beside it so the liquid wouldn't solidify overnight. Weapons were rested near its slow, steady warmth to keep firing mechanisms from icing shut. In some shelters, families even used heat candles to warm thin sheets of metal or clay, turning them into makeshift heat radiators. This was no longer just an object. It was a system, a pocket-sized ecosystem of warmth, moisture control, gear preservation, and human resilience. Every variation told a story. A family finding one more way to live, a soldier learning one more trick to keep frostbite at bay, a community sharing knowledge that helped the next household survive. The heat candle wasn't a single invention. It was a field of inventions, thousands of tiny adaptations, each quietly saving lives in a winter the world was never prepared for. 12th, the limits of the heat candle. Honesty builds trust. To understand the true value of the heat candle, we must also acknowledge its limits. It cannot warm a large room. It cannot replace a stove. It cannot serve as a long-term heating solution. And in unventilated places, it can be dangerous. The heat it offers is small, humble, and fragile. But those limits are precisely what make its success so profound. Because in the deadliest nights of WWII, survival didn't demand comfort. It demanded only a few degrees, just enough to keep hands functional, to stop breath from tightening in the lungs, to keep the heart from slipping into hypothermia's downward spiral. The heat candle was never designed to help people live well. It was designed unintentionally to help people live just long enough. It created a narrow zone of life in a world full of ice. And that was enough. In a night at -20 degrees, you don't need luxury. You don't need blankets of warmth sweeping through the room. You need only to stay above the threshold where cold becomes death. The heat candle did not save homes, it saved bodies. And sometimes that is the most honest definition of survival. 13th, conclusion. When history doesn't whisper but warn, the people who survived the winter of 1944 were not stronger than us. They were not wiser, or more gifted, or more prepared. What they had was understanding of physics, of biology, and of the razor-thin boundary between life and loss. They recognized that survival is not a heroic act. It is a scientific one, a practical one, a disciplined one. They learned how heat behaves, they learned how the body fails, and they learned how to work with the world as it is, not as they wished it to be. Their lesson is still staring at us today, as relevant as it was in the frozen ruins of World War II. In war and in winter, history does not whisper. It teaches clearly, sharply, relentlessly. The question is whether we choose to listen.